The fluorescent lights in probate courtroom, too, hummed above my head, the way they always do in government buildings, that low, indifferent drone that doesn't care what gets decided beneath it. I'd been sitting at the respondent's table for 20 minutes, watching my late wife's sister whisper to her attorney while her husband sat behind her in the gallery, arms crossed, the faint smirk of a man who's already decided how this ends. My sister-in-law's lawyer, a polished woman named Darlene Forsyth from the firm of Forsyth and Webb, set a stack of documents on the table and adjusted her reading glasses before turning to the judge. Your Honor, the petitioner's position is straightforward. Mr. Walter Greer has occupied the family home at 1140 Birchwood Lane for 11 years, the final 3 of which he has lived there alone following the death of his wife, Patricia Greer, née Holloway. The property was originally purchased by the Holloway Family Trust, a trust established by Patricia's parents, Harold and Edna Holloway, in 1987. Mr. Greer's name does not appear on the trust documentation as a beneficiary. He is, legally speaking, a tenant who has not paid rent. She let that last sentence sit in the room like a dropped plate. I was wearing the blue flannel shirt I'd bought at Walmart 3 winters ago. $9 and change on the clearance rack. My khakis had a fray at the left pocket I'd been meaning to fix since last spring. My shoes were clean, at least. I'd made sure of that. My attorney was a young man named Daniel Park, 29 years old, 2 years out of law school, assigned to me through a legal aid organization because, as far as anyone in that room knew, I was a retired school maintenance worker living on a fixed income who couldn't afford better representation. Daniel shifted in his chair. He'd wanted to file a counter-motion 3 weeks ago. I'd told him to hold off. He hadn't liked that answer. Mr. Greer. The judge was a man in his mid-60s named Robert Callahan, the kind of face that had spent decades listening to people tell him stories. He looked at me over his glasses. You've been relatively quiet this morning. Do you have anything to say in response to Miss Forsyth's characterization of your residency? Daniel glanced at me. I gave him the same small nod I'd been practicing in my bathroom mirror for 2 weeks. No, Your Honor. Not at this time. My sister-in-law turned in her seat to look at me directly. She had Patricia's same dark eyes, but none of Patricia's warmth in them. What she had instead was the particular satisfaction of a person who believes they've already won. Her husband chuckled from the gallery. Actually chuckled. The sound carried in the quiet courtroom like something embarrassing dropped on a tile floor. Mr. Greer. Judge Callahan set down his pen. Before we proceed to closing arguments on the eviction motion, I need to verify some information for the record. Please state your full legal name for the court. I took a breath. This was the moment I'd been waiting for. Walter James Greer, I said. Retired GS-15, Federal Emergency Management Agency. Former Chief Structural Engineer, Hazard Mitigation Division. The room didn't erupt. It did something quieter and more significant than that. It went still. Judge Callahan's pen stopped moving mid-sentence. He looked up at me slowly. I watched something shift behind his eyes, recognition, recalibration, the expression of a man who has just realized the map he was using doesn't match the territory. I'm sorry, he said. Could you repeat that? Walter James Greer. Your Honor, I can provide my Federal Service ID and my professional engineering license if it would help the record. I reached into the inside pocket of my flannel shirt and placed both cards on the table. The judge's clerk, a young man with rectangular glasses, leaned forward, looked at the cards, and then leaned back and looked at Judge Callahan with an expression I recognized. It was the expression of someone who has just understood that the quiet, underdressed old man at the respondent's table is not what he appeared to be. Miss Forsyth was on her feet. Your Honor, I'm not sure what this has to do with. Sit down, counselor. She sat. My sister-in-law had turned completely around in her chair. Her husband was no longer chuckling. He was staring at me with the first genuine emotion I'd seen from him all morning, and it was not the emotion he'd walked in with. What happened next took 4 minutes. It felt like 4 seconds and 4 hours simultaneously. 2 men entered from the side door of the courtroom. not uniformed officers' suits, the kind of suits that mean something specific in federal proceedings. One of them carried a document folded in thirds. They walked to the petitioner's table. My sister-in-law's husband stood up in the gallery. "What is this? What's happening?" The first man looked at him. "Sir, please remain seated." Mrs. Caroline Holloway Marsh. My sister-in-law stood slowly from her chair, the color leaving her face the way color leaves a photograph left in the sun. "Yes?" "And Mr. Dennis Marsh." Her husband gripped the gallery railing. "You are both named in a federal civil complaint filed this morning in the Eastern District Court regarding the misappropriation of trust assets, wire fraud, and breach of fiduciary duty in connection with the Holloway Family Trust, established 1987. You'll want to contact your attorneys. Your own attorneys, not Miss Forsyth." My sister-in-law looked at me across the courtroom. "Walter." Her voice came out strange and small. "What did you do?" I didn't answer her. I just sat there in my $9 Walmart flannel shirt and watched the woman who had spent the last 3 years calling me a squatter get served with a federal complaint in open court. My name is Walter Greer. I'm 63 years old, and most people look at me and see exactly what I intend them to see. A tired old man who lost his wife, puttering around in a house that isn't legally his anymore, too proud or too confused to leave gracefully. I spent 31 years as a structural engineer for FEMA, the last 11 as a GS-15 chief in the Hazard Mitigation Division. My job was to look at things that appeared stable and find the hidden fractures before they became collapses. I was very good at it. Then Patricia died, and I was just a widower in a flannel shirt, and nobody pays much attention to those. That's exactly how I needed it. Let me tell you how this really started. Patricia and I met in 1985 at a conference in Louisville. She was a civil engineer with the state. I was 2 years into my federal career, full of myself in the particular way that young engineers are, convinced that the ability to calculate load-bearing capacity translates to some broader competence in life. Patricia disabused me of that notion within 40 minutes of meeting me, and I fell in love with her because of it. We were married in 1987. No children of our own, that was a quiet grief we carried together and eventually made peace with. We had each other, and we had her family, and for a long time that felt like enough. Her family was complicated. Her parents, Harold and Edna, were generous people who'd built a modest real estate portfolio in Tennessee and Virginia over 40 years of careful work. When they established the Holloway Family Trust, they intended it to provide stability for their 2 daughters, Patricia and her younger sister, Caroline, and whatever families those daughters built. Patricia was the steady one. Caroline was something else. I'd known since the first Thanksgiving that Caroline's husband, Dennis Marsh, had a particular relationship with money, specifically with other people's money. He had the easy charm of a man who treats financial details as tedious obstacles rather than binding obligations. He worked in real estate investment, which in his case meant finding other people's capital and finding creative explanations for where it went. Patricia never fully trusted him. She told me once, very quietly, on a drive home from a Christmas dinner, that she thought Dennis had borrowed against Harold's generosity one too many times. "He knows Dad won't push back," she said. "Dad doesn't like conflict. Dennis knows exactly how to use that." I filed that observation away the way I file everything carefully, in a place I can retrieve it. Patricia was diagnosed in the spring of her 62nd year, pancreatic cancer. We had 14 months from diagnosis to the morning. I sat with her in our bedroom at 1140 Birchwood Lane while she told me she wasn't afraid, and I told her I would be all right, and we both knew which of us was lying. She died on a Tuesday in October. 2 weeks later, Dennis mentioned the trust. It wasn't aggressive at first. He came by the house ostensibly to check on me, stood in the kitchen drinking my coffee, and said, in the tone of a man doing a favor, that he'd been reviewing the trust documents and there might be some questions about the property going forward. Just so I was aware. Patricia always wanted to make sure things were settled clearly, he said. I said I appreciated him letting me know, offered him more coffee, and showed him to the door. That night, I sat at the desk in Patricia's study and started reading every document I had access to regarding the Holloway Family Trust. I'm an engineer. I read the way engineers read, not for the parts that are clearly stated, but for the parts that are conspicuously absent. It took me 1 week to find the first discrepancy. It took me 3 months to understand what I was actually looking at. Harold and Edna had established the trust with 4 primary assets: the family home in Nashville, a commercial property in Knoxville, a small apartment building in Bristol, and a stock portfolio worth roughly $800,000 at the time of establishment. Harold had died in 2018. Edna passed in 2021, 6 months before Patricia. Between 2018 and the time I started looking, the commercial property in Knoxville had been quietly sold, the proceeds rolling into a subsidiary account I'd never heard mentioned. The apartment building in Bristol had been refinanced twice, drawing out $340,000 in equity. The stock portfolio had been restructured through a financial advisory firm that, when I looked it up, had Dennis Marsh listed as a consulting partner. What remained in the trust, by my calculation, was roughly 40 cents on the dollar of what Harold and Edna had placed there. Caroline was the sole surviving trustee. She had been since Edna's death. I sat back from my desk and thought about Patricia, about what she'd said in the car that Christmas, about what she would have wanted me to do. Then I thought about what I was actually equipped to do. I had 31 years of experience following structural failures backward to their origins. I knew how to document, how to build a case from evidence outward, how to make something so airtight that the people who would prefer it to disappear cannot make it disappear. I also knew that if I called a lawyer or contacted authorities the way a normal person would, Dennis would know within a week. He had the instincts of someone who has been managing exposure his entire adult life. He would move money, revise documents, find technical defenses. The evidence I had was suggestive, but not yet sufficient. I needed time, and I needed to stay invisible, which meant I needed to stop looking like a man with anything worth protecting. I made 2 decisions that changed everything. The first was to call my old colleague at FEMA, a woman named Margaret Osei who'd moved to the Inspector General's office after her last field rotation. We'd worked together on 3 major disaster assessments over the years. She was the most meticulous person I'd ever met, which is a significant statement coming from a structural engineer. We had lunch at a diner outside of Falls Church, the kind of place with laminated menus and coffee that comes in ceramic mugs. I laid out everything I'd found, every document, every discrepancy, every thread. Margaret listened without interrupting. When I was done, she was quiet for a long moment. "Walter," she said, "you know that as soon as you bring this through official channels, they'll see it coming." "I know. Dennis Marsh has friends in state-level real estate circles, possibly federal too. I've seen files go quiet on smaller cases than this." "I know that as well." She looked at me. "What do you need?" "Time," I said, "and a contact at the Federal Civil Division who isn't connected to anyone Dennis might know. Someone who can receive documentation quietly and hold it until I'm ready." "That's a very specific ask. You're a very specific person." Margaret almost smiled. "How long do you need?" "However long it takes. 2 years, maybe 3. And while you're building this, you're going to keep playing the grieving widower who can barely manage his bills? A retired maintenance worker, actually. I've already let my professional licenses lapse from public records. Technically, they're still active, but they won't show up on a casual search." She shook her head slowly. "You're not doing this just for the trust, are you?" I thought about Patricia in that bedroom, about the way she'd said she wasn't afraid. "My wife spent her whole life being careful," I said. "She paid into that trust for 30 years. She died believing her sister would honor what her parents built. I want to know what actually happened to it. All of it." Margaret nodded. "I'll make some calls." The second decision was harder. I stopped being Walter Greer, federal engineer. I became Walter Greer, retired school maintenance man, the quiet old widower in the flannel shirts who couldn't afford a real attorney and didn't fully understand the legal proceedings being brought against him. I let Caroline and Dennis believe they were pushing against a door that would eventually open. I responded to their legal filings slowly, with Daniel's earnest but overmatched assistance, just competently enough to not lose immediately. I let them get comfortable. I let Dennis get arrogant. People like Dennis Marsh run on the fuel of other people's underestimation. Take that away, and they make mistakes. Give them too much of it, and they get careless. I needed him careless. The investigation took 2.5 years. I worked at the desk in Patricia's study every night after 9, when the neighborhood was quiet. Encrypted drives, careful documentation, a paper trail built not from intuition but from evidence that would stand up to scrutiny by people who were paid to find holes in it. What I found was worse than I'd initially understood. Caroline and Dennis hadn't just drawn down the trust assets. They'd been systematically liquidating the Holloway family's real estate holdings going back to 2016, 2 years before Harold died. The proceeds had been funneled through 3 different investment vehicles, 2 of which were nominally in Caroline's name but effectively controlled by Dennis. The money had funded a series of real estate development projects in Florida, projects that carried Dennis's fingerprints and Harold's capital and had been presented to no one in the family as what they actually were. The stock portfolio restructuring had cost the trust $190,000 in unnecessary fees paid to the advisory firm where Dennis had his consulting arrangement. Total documented misappropriation, $2.3 million across 7 years. Patricia's share of the trust, had it been managed according to Harold and Edna's original intent, would have been worth roughly $1.1 million at the time of her death. What actually remained in the trust when Caroline filed for probate review was $280,000, most of it in the family home, the home they were now trying to take from me. I submitted the complete documentation to Margaret's contact at the Federal Civil Division in March. I requested a specific timeline for action. I had one condition. I needed them to move on a particular date at a particular proceeding, because I had already found out which judge would be assigned to the probate hearing. Judge Robert Callahan had been a trust and estate attorney for 20 years before his appointment to the bench. His mother had been defrauded by a predatory financial advisor in 2009. I'd found the civil case in public records. He had spent much of his legal career representing elderly clients whose estates had been mismanaged by the people they trusted most. He would know what he was looking at the moment I said my name, and he would know what it meant that I'd been sitting quietly in that room all morning in a $9 flannel shirt. The morning of the hearing, I woke at 5. Patricia used to say I couldn't sleep before anything important, that my brain treated anticipation and dread identically, which she thought explained a lot about engineers. She wasn't wrong. I made coffee and sat for a while in the kitchen in the early dark, at the table where we'd had 10,000 breakfasts. The house felt large and quiet the way houses do when you've been the only one in them long enough. I thought about what I was setting in motion. Caroline was going to face serious legal consequences. She was Patricia's sister. Whatever she'd done, whatever had curdled in her over the years, she had also been at Patricia's bedside in those last weeks. She'd wept at the funeral in a way that didn't look performed. People are complicated, and the bad things they do don't erase all the other things they are. I wasn't doing this for revenge. I want to be clear about that, because it matters. I was doing it because Harold and Edna Holloway worked for 40 years and trusted their family, and that trust had been violated in ways that made every year of their careful work a kind of lie. I was doing it because Patricia had deserved to know the truth about what happened to her family's legacy. I was doing it because if I walked out of that house quietly, as Dennis expected me to, then the story ended with the wrong people winning, and I had spent my entire career making sure that structures which should not stand do not stand. I put on the flannel shirt. I drove to the courthouse. I sat down at the respondent's table, and I waited. The chaos after the complaint was served lasted about 6 minutes. Dennis kept insisting, in an increasingly strained voice, that there must be some mistake, that he had attorneys, that this was harassment. Caroline said nothing. She had sat back down in her chair and was looking at her hands with the expression of a person who has been waiting, somewhere in the back of their mind, for something like this to happen. Miss Forsythe asked for an immediate recess. She was pale. Judge Callahan denied it. He looked at me across the courtroom for a moment. Then he removed his glasses and set them on the bench. Mr. Greer, I reviewed a summary of the civil complaint this morning before the session began. I have to tell you, in 30-some years in trust law and on this bench, I've seen estates mismanaged, I've seen beneficiaries shortchanged, I've seen trusts eroded by negligence and greed. What you've documented here is on a different scale. My in-laws were careful people, Your Honor. They deserved better. He was quiet for a moment. They did. He turned to Miss Forsyth, who appeared to be reviewing her professional life choices in real time. Counselor, the eviction motion is suspended pending full review of the trust's asset history and the outcome of the federal civil complaint. Mr. Greer will remain in residency at 1140 Birchwood Lane until this court has a complete picture of what this trust actually contains and who it actually belongs to. He paused. I'd also suggest your firm retain its own independent counsel before your next appearance in this matter. Miss Forsyth nodded once and sat down heavily. I called my nephew that afternoon. Patricia's brother's son, he's the closest thing I have to immediate family, a 38-year-old high school history teacher in Roanoke named Paul, who'd driven up for the hearing and waited in the parking lot because I'd told him not to come inside. How'd it go? He asked when I got to the car. I told him. He was quiet for a long moment. Uncle Walter, he said finally, how long have you been working on this? About 2.5 years. Does Margaret know? She was the one who made it possible. Another silence. Aunt Patricia would have had feelings about this. I thought about that. Patricia had been a practical woman and a fair one. She had loved her sister despite everything, and she had believed, perhaps more than was warranted, that people were capable of better than their worst choices. She would have wanted the truth, I said. She just would have felt terrible about it. That sounds right. We sat in the parking lot for a while, not really talking. Paul had brought sandwiches from a deli down the street. We ate them in the car like two people who didn't know what else to do with themselves after a long-anticipated thing finally happens. The civil case took 14 months to fully resolve. The forensic accounting the federal investigators brought in confirmed everything I'd documented and found additional transactions I hadn't caught. The final tally was $2.6 million in misappropriated trust assets over 9 years. Dennis negotiated a settlement that included full financial restitution from the liquidation of his Florida development properties, disgorgement of the consulting fees, and a consent judgment that would follow him for the rest of his financial life. He avoided criminal prosecution by cooperating fully and returning every dollar that could be traced. I'm told he returned them with the enthusiasm of a man who has been given a very clear view of the alternative. Caroline pled to a reduced civil liability in exchange for her cooperation and testimony regarding the full scope of the transactions. The judge in the civil case did not go easy on her. She spent considerable time in that courtroom hearing exactly what she had done to her parents' legacy, in specific dollar amounts, over specific years. I was told she cried for most of the second day. I wasn't there for it. I didn't need to be. What I did attend was the probate hearing, 4 months after the civil case closed, at which Judge Callahan formally restored the trust to its intended purpose and confirmed my residency at 1140 Birchwood Lane for the duration of my life, in accordance with provisions Harold and Edna had originally included and which Dennis had been quietly trying to interpret out of existence. After that hearing, Daniel Park found me in the courthouse hallway. He'd been my attorney through all of it. Once he found out who he was actually representing, he'd stopped telling me I was making mistakes and started telling me what he needed from me to do his job properly. He'd done it well. I have a question, he said. Ask. Why me? You could have had any attorney in the district once the federal case was filed. Why keep me on? I thought about that. You didn't condescend to me, I said. When I came to you, you saw a retired maintenance worker who couldn't pay his bills, and you treated the case seriously anyway. That matters. He looked a little uncomfortable in the way that young people do when they receive a compliment they weren't prepared for. I should tell you, he said, that I told my father about this case. He's a retired civil engineer. I laughed. It came out more tired than I expected, but real. Margaret came to visit in the fall, about a year after everything was settled. We sat on the back porch of the house on Birchwood Lane with glasses of iced tea, watching the last of the afternoon light move across the yard that Patricia had spent 20 years planting and tending. "You could have gone back to FEMA," Margaret said. "They offered a consulting role after the case made their quarterly report." "I know. You turned it down." "I did." "Why?" I looked at the garden. Patricia had planted a rosebed along the back fence in 2003. It had gotten unruly while she was sick, and I hadn't had the heart to cut it back properly in the years since. I was going to fix that this fall. I'd decided. "I spent 30 years assessing structural failures in other people's buildings," I said. It felt like it was time to take care of my own. Margaret nodded slowly. She understood that kind of answer. "How are you, Walter?" That question takes longer to answer than the other ones. I miss Patricia every day, not the desperate, disorienting grief of the first year, which I would not wish on anyone but the quieter, permanent kind. The kind that lives in the kitchen, in the early morning, and in the passenger seat of the car, and in a garden that needs tending. I am doing the work of being all right, which is the only work available and not nothing. Paul brings his kids down from Roanoke once a month. My great-nephew is 8 years old and has recently decided that helping me in the garage is the best possible use of a Saturday afternoon. He hands me tools with immense seriousness and asks questions about how things work with an appetite I recognize. Last month, he asked me why I had so many papers on my desk. I told him I used to find problems in buildings before the buildings fell down. "Like an inspector?" he said. "Like that, yes. What if the building already fell down?" I thought about the question. "Then you figure out what caused it," I said, "so it doesn't happen to the next one." He considered this for a moment, the way 8-year-olds do when they're deciding whether an answer is satisfying. "Okay," he said finally. "Can I have a granola bar?" That evening, I sat in Patricia's study and thought about something she'd said early in our marriage, during one of those conversations that seem ordinary when they happen and only reveal their full weight years later. We'd been talking about her parents, about the kind of people who build things quietly and carefully and expect the things they build to outlast them. They always said the point of a foundation, she told me, isn't the building on top of it. It's the ground it makes possible. I have thought about that many times in the years since, about what gets built on what ground, about what it costs to protect the things worth protecting, about the difference between winning and recovering something that should never have been taken. Sometimes my nephew asks me if I have any regrets. About the years of pretending to be less than I was, about letting Caroline and Dennis believe the door was open, about the long, quiet work of it. I tell him what I believe to be true, that the flannel shirt was just a shirt, that the patience was just patience. That what I am is what I was the whole time, a man who looks at structures other people have declared sound and finds the places where they are not. The house on Birchwood Lane is sound. I checked it myself. Harold and Edna built on good ground. I intend to keep it that way.